In this video, I want to critique Whatifalthist's take on Lord of the Rings. Okay, let us start.
Between Sauron and the Soviet Union are beyond eerie. Both are giant multi-ethnic empires in the East bent upon the destruction of the free peoples. Both are run by sociopathic totalitarians in a giant tower in a wasteland, are terrible for the environment, did unimaginable evils, aim at sublimating the individual into the group. Both use media to co-opt elites in the free world to fight for them, have bizarre slave economies that don't really make sense, and you wonder why anyone would support them if they literally say they want to destroy their whole civilization.
Okay, just a few truth bombs to start off this video. So first of all, the Soviets never claimed they want to destroy their whole civilization. They want to build a new civilization, which, okay, in order to build a new civilization, you need to drastically reform the old civilization, which was basically the Russian Empire. Not a just and good place for most people, the Russian Empire that was. And other than that, well, okay, he mentions slave labor, and I do think that to describe the Soviet economy under Stalin, for example, as using slave labor is a fair assessment. People in the gulags were not literally slaves, but they were forced to work in a slave-like conditions. But what Whatifalthist probably doesn't know is that colonial empires also forced people to work in a slave-like conditions. For example, the Cambodian peasants under the French feudal lords were forced to give 80% sometimes of all their rice to their masters, which left them starving. Which is why, quite ironically, when Pol Pot took power, many at first did not even notice the difference between starvation under the French colonialists and between this new kind of starvation now done by the communists. Yeah, so Whatifalthist probably is not aware of the fact that colonial empires also caused starvation, like for example the Bengal famine. And also to say that Sauron is a sociopath is, I don't know, I don't think he's a sociopath. He isn't even human. He's like a demon. He's supposed to symbolize the devil or this absolute evil that exists. But okay, let us continue.
Even if Tolkien didn't want to write an allegory to the modern world, Lord of the Rings was written right at the end of World War II, when communism had just seized control of all Central Europe and China, and looked poised to go even further, so it made sense that it was in the back of his mind as he was writing it. Also, what ended up happening was the Soviets were defeated by an alliance of the Free Peoples, and the Soviet Empire kind of fell apart for bizarre reasons without even a major war once its magical spell, that being the myth of successful communism, failed. A fun side note here is that a Russian author actually wrote a version of Lord of the Rings in which Mordor was the good guys, and Mordor was a force of equalization in the world, where the elves were racist, bent upon keeping humans down, and the Western Order and the Free Peoples were fundamentally colonialist and based off old, outdated aristocracy, and they're trying to keep down the East, which was trying to rise from the future and fully liberate mankind. And in this Russian author's worldview, Sauron's really the good guy because he's trying to liberate people from the old constraints. And isn't that just so ironic that Russian audiences read Lord of the Rings and thought, we identify with Sauron, and then a Russian author literally wrote a book in which Sauron was the good guy? And
Okay, yeah. To me, it's beginning to look like every single Whatifalthist video, at least in recent times, needs to have a place where he completely goes off the rails and just completely misses the point. Completely, like, says the opposite of what is the truth. So, I actually decided to research this bizarre work done by Kirill Eskov. Well, first of all, yeah, it was written in 1999, so it was written just as Putin was about to become the new Russian leader. And the point of the Russian author Kirill Eskov was not that Russian audiences like Mordor. It's not like the Russian people read Lord of the Rings and thought to themselves, well, look, this really evil authoritarian guy that uses slaves, is pro-genocide, is pro-racist, wants to control the world. We really sympathize with that. We really see these parallels between Russia and the orcs. No, that's not what happened. what happened is that the entire point of Kirill Eskov was that Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, was written from the perspective of the victors. His point is that this idea that all orcs are evil, which Tolkien explains why that's the case, because Sauron made them evil by using his evil magic. But Kirill Eskov, in my humble opinion, in a brilliant way, kind of exploits this, let's say, cartoonish or a bit black and white element that exists in Tolkien's literature, which, by the way, I'm not bothered by. I actually am a huge Tolkien fan, but I also like Kirill Eskov's critique, which kind of reminds me of George R.R. Martin. So Kirill Eskov's point was that actually what we heard was Elven propaganda, was essentially Western propaganda about Mordor. And his point is that no, it's not true that all orcs are evil. And the main character in this bizarre Eskov novel is actually a young orc named Haladin that joins the Mordorian army in order to impress his orcish girlfriend. And yeah, he decides to go to the military instead of going to college, which is what his parents wanted him to do. But okay, the point is, yeah, it's not like Kirill like saw Russians as orcs. His entire point was that Lord of the Rings was essentially Western, or in this case, Elvish propaganda. And his point is that Mordor actually isn't evil, that we just saw Mordor from the perspective of the elves that were actually imperialists spreading propaganda in order to do what Eskov calls the final solution on the orcs. And Eskov actually has a point, because it is usually in the real world, when we hear that an entire race is evil, that's usually a lie. So in fantasy worlds, that doesn't need to be a lie, but Eskov's version here is maybe even a bit more realistic than Tolkien's version. And by the way, as I already said, I actually love Tolkien, but I also do think that it is interesting to kind of parody or subvert the high fantasy genre of Lord of the Rings in this way. And okay, to me it is also obvious that Eskov was actually making the point about the Cold War. Just as he wrote his book, this new interpretation of the Cold War became popular in the West, and that is just as the Russian archives were open, many historians, such as the Black Book of Communism that was written by Western historians, proclaimed that the Soviets were actually worse than the fascists because they killed more people. And I disagree with that interpretation. You can't just count the dead bodies in order to determine who did more evil. Plus, this entire idea that Stalin actually killed more is very problematic, but okay, I have another video about it. But yes, Eskov was essentially critiquing this idea that Soviet Union was evil and imperialistic, and that the West was all about freedom and democracy. And to me it seems that Whatifalthist, for some bizarre reason, is also refusing to acknowledge that the Cold War was not just a war of democracy versus authoritarianism, because the West had absolutely zero problem becoming allied with some of the worst regimes on earth, such as the Somoza family in Nicaragua, Indonesian dictatorship under General Suharto that genocided 2 million Chinese people. Hell, even China became de facto an ally of the United States under Richard Nixon, and China was much more authoritarian and totalitarian than the Soviet Union. So okay, but let us continue.
This book actually sold very well in Russia because the Russians don't keep strong copyrights. As alluded to before, another big similarity is communism and Sauron's abilities to needle themselves into the elite in Western countries through controlling the media and selling attractive narratives that they must win, and they can build a new, good, better world. In both of the big human kingdoms, Gondor and Rohan, the government is controlled by pro-Sauron interests who establish themselves through the Palantir, which is a crystal ball, a lot like a television, or radio in Tolkien's time, that spins narratives to favor Sauron. The West is the most open-minded society in history, and the negative of that is that it's capable of catching bad ideologies, like communism, that literally say they want to kill the previous society, and have killed 80 million people. It's also similar to social justice today, which has been able to seize control of the West's institutions, literally on a platform of demolishing the previous society. Grandma Wormtongue is a great example of a local elite who pushes this Sauron agenda as a way for him to get into power over a society, in the same way that communists have done this to get into power over their own societies once the revolution comes. The example I think of is when the Chinese invaded Tibet, and the Chinese communists destroyed the previous Tibetan civilization almost in its entirety. Local Tibetans literally opened the valleys and opened the gates of Tibet in order to let the communists in, because they assumed if the communists won, they would become the local commissars and rulers. And the way I like to compare this is that the West is the most open-minded civilization, which means we can adopt the best changes like women's rights or full suffrage or technological advancements or the Enlightenment. The problem when you're open is that you start licking the toilet bowl, where you get so open that you start catching viruses. To jump over to a different key point, I think that Lord of the Rings has such perfect metaphors for addiction and drug abuse. For the people who carry the ring, it's exactly like an addiction, in that its power over a person becomes stronger and stronger before it totally consumes them. Over time, the addiction consumes more and more of the person's identity until nothing else matters, while their body and mind wither away.
Okay, and just I want to finish on the note of actually recognizing that yes, the Soviet Union did have an impressively well-developed network of spies, but it is also true that all great civilizations and systems were trying to do exactly the same thing that the Soviet Union was trying to do. For example, in Britain, many in the royal family sympathized with Hitler and actually wanted to make peace with Hitler, but Churchill disagreed. And in the same way in which many in the West were influenced by communist thinkers, you can maybe even make the case that social justice, which is ultimately a very different philosophy, is influenced by Marxism. In the same way, Gorbachev was actually influenced by some liberal thinkers, or by thinkers that were trying to combine liberalism with Marxism. So yeah, he's presenting it as if the communists were the only ones spreading their propaganda abroad, which is what pretty much all great civilizations and systems do. And finally, the most interesting part about this crazy Russian Lord of the Rings to me was actually this idea that Sauron was actually all about progress and industrialization and developing new technology, and that the elves wanted to keep the world in this traditionalist status quo in which people rely on magic and not on technology. And I actually agree with some Western authors that actually even think that Eskov's critique of this ultra-traditionalism in Tolkien's work is justified. Of course, I'm not saying that Tolkien's work is bad, but this idea that technology and progress actually do more bad than good, it's not a good idea. And yes, we do need to develop technology, but of course we also need to be careful of not harming nature too much, because ultimately destroying nature can lead to the destruction of our entire species. But yes, this idea that technology and modernism are bad definitely are present. These ideas are present in Tolkien's work, and ultimately I disagree with those ideas. And I would be interested in knowing if Whatifalthist also shares this ultra-traditionalist view that technology and modernism in most of its aspects are actually bad for the human condition. And Eskov, as many other modernist ideologies such as communism, also disagreed with this aspect of Tolkien's philosophy. But I don't have to agree with the author in order to appreciate the work, which is why I still think that Lord of the Rings is one of the best books ever written. And on that note, I can finish with at least agreeing with Whatifalthist about something. We both like Tolkien.